Immediately contesting the center establishes an early footprint, influencing piece development and potential pawn breaks. Developing the knight to a dynamic square aims to control central squares and prepare for further piece activity, setting up an aggressive posture. Claiming central space and challenging black's knight's influence with an ambitious pawn advance. Securing the center and preparing for the bishop's development, this move embraces a more solid positional setup. Developing a knight here aims to control central squares and prepare for pawn advances, potentially leading to king safety concerns for black if not handled carefully. Challenging the center immediately creates dynamic imbalances and opens lines for an aggressive fight for central dominance. Developing another knight efficiently secures the center and prepares for castling, while simultaneously pressuring black's pawn. Developing the knight to d7 offers flexibility, preparing to recapture on e5 or bolster the central pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing for a kingside fianchetto, this subtly repositions forces for potential queenside expansion. Solidifying the fianchetto structure aims to control the long diagonal and prepare for kingside castling, though it concedes central space. Unleashing the bishop's power, this natural development readies it to exert influence over the long diagonal, a crucial aspect of controlling the center and preparing for potential kingside expansion. Developing the bishop to its natural long diagonal here completes the fianchetto setup, solidifying control over the central dark squares and preparing for a potential kingside castling, while keeping the pawn chain on d6 and e5 flexible for future action. Castling neatly tucks the monarch away, creating a secure haven while simultaneously preparing for queenside expansion with a rook now ready to join the fray. Solidifying the king's position with castling is a prudent step, harmonizing with the development of the kingside pieces and preparing for future central operations. Challenging the center directly, this aggressive thrust aims to seize more space and potentially disrupt black's pawn structure, forcing a decisive confrontation in the crucial central squares rather than allowing a slow positional buildup. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn advances, this move anchors the d6 pawn, preventing white from easily exploiting the center with e5. It also opens the door for the queen to potentially join the queenside action or support a central pawn push later. Reinforcing the d4 pawn while subtly preparing for a queenside expansion with a potential a4-a5 push, this maneuver seeks to restrict black's central ambitions. It also solidifies the pawn chain and hints at developing the bishop to b2 for long-range pressure. Clearing the central tension by taking the pawn now loosens white's grip on d4 and opens the e-file for potential future pressure, but it also sacrifices a tempo and allows white to regain central space if they choose the right follow-up. This exchange invites a positional battle where controlling key squares will be paramount. Reclaiming the center with the knight immediately addresses black's recent pawn exchange, re-establishing a solid pawn structure and offering greater piece activity. White now eyes the d-file, creating potential for future pressure. This knight, well placed on d4, acts as a powerful outpost, disrupting black's pawn chain and limiting their piece mobility. The immediate recapture also prepares for queenside expansion or further central control. Shifting the rook from its initial placement on f8 to e8 accomplishes a few important things. It reinforces the e5 pawn, prepares for potential pawn pushes on the kingside, and offers the possibility of utilizing the e-file should it open up. This reassures the central pawn structure. Focusing the bishop's gaze onto the long diagonal creates immediate pressure along the a1-h8 axis, particularly threatening the weakened dark squares around black's king and aiming to disrupt the pawn structure should black dare to advance his central pawns. Shifting the knight to c5 is a bold maneuver, instantly challenging white's central pawn structure and eyeing the often weakened d4 square. This aggressive repositioning of the knight simultaneously prepares for potential pawn pushes like e4, aiming to crack open the center, while also offering a tactical exchange if white is not careful with their knight on d4. Consider the tension this creates. The knight on c5 is now a very active piece, actively participating in the fight for central squares and potentially forcing white's hand. It's a dynamic declaration of intent, signaling a desire to break free from passive development and engage in more combative play in the coming moves. Initiating central pressure via the queen's active deployment sets the stage for potential pawn storms or swift piece integrations. A bold foray into enemy territory, the knight charges forward, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious development and exploit potential weaknesses around the kingside. Instilling piece harmony, white immediately contests the d-file, anticipating a potential pawn push or piece intrusion, aiming to dismantle black's central aspirations and solidify control over that crucial corridor. Asserting presence on the king's flank, this aggressive queen sortie immediately questions white's seemingly solid setup, aiming to disrupt the harmony of pieces and potentially create weaknesses around the castled monarch. Challenging that bold knight, white seeks to disrupt black's kingside initiative before it truly gains momentum, preparing to redistribute forces and perhaps reopen lines on the queenside once the immediate threat is dealt with. A tentative retreat, NH6 offers little immediate benefit and surrenders the initiative, effectively inviting white to consolidate their advantageous piece placement and prepare for a central breakthrough. Asserting control over the queenside, this pawn thrust immediately challenges black's knight and aims to expand white's footprint, creating a decisive pawn chain that could soon restrict black's pieces. Emerging from behind its knight's defensive screen, the black steed now eyes the weakened king's flank, seeking to exploit the newly opened diagonal. Unshackling the knight from its defensive post on g4 allows it to rejoin the central fray, aiming to contest the d4 square and potentially disrupt black's pawn chain on the queenside. This repositioning signals a shift from passive defense to more active counterplay, seeking to exploit any lingering weaknesses in black's coordination. Shifting the queen to e7 prepares to support the d-pawn's advance and potentially reroute the knight from c5 to a more active square, while simultaneously defending against any immediate threats on the kingside. Rethinking the central pawn structure, white aims to solidify their control over the e-file and prepare for a potential kingside advance, while simultaneously addressing black's knight on c5, which is eyeing the d3 square. This move reclaims central space that was ceded earlier and offers a clear path for the other rook to join the action, potentially on the d-file or even swinging to the kingside if the opportunity arises. It's a move that signals an intention to gradually increase pressure and improve piece coordination, without immediately creating tactical fireworks. Reinforcing the central pawn complex with f6 prepares for future pawn, pushes and supports the knight's potentially precarious position on e6, preventing immediate tactical disruptions. Shifting the king to a safer square, 18. KH2 offers better protection against potential central pawn breaks and indirect threats developing along the kingside, while also opening a diagonal for potential future rook activity on the h-file. After a period of maneuvering, black solidifies his knight's position on f7, a square that grants increased defensive coverage for his monarch and prepares for a potential kingside pawn advance. Aimed at the kingside, this knight redistribution seeks to exploit the recently vacated g-file and pressure the pawn structure surrounding black's monarch, though it might temporarily leave the center less defended against potential counterplay. Preparing to reposition that knight to its more active square on d7 was a sound idea, though the immediate threat of the white knight advancing to g6 certainly complicates the picture. Instead of allowing a direct knight exchange or doubling pawns, rerouting the knight back towards the kingside offers a defensive and potentially counterattacking posture. The knight's journey via f8 aims to bring it closer to the center and prepare for potential involvement on the kingside, perhaps supporting a pawn push or covering weaknesses. It's a patient maneuver, acknowledging white's initiative on the kingside and prioritizing consolidation before launching any ambitious plans. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white signals a bold offensive intent, seeking to break open lines towards black's castled king and exploit the potential weakness created by the prior pawn advances. This counterstrike on the queenside seeks to disrupt white's central control and create immediate counterplay, particularly targeting the b4 pawn and potentially opening lines for black's pieces. Unleashing a powerful pawn storm on the queen side, white disrupts black's queenside structure and aims to cramp their position, potentially opening lines for aggressive play while simultaneously advancing white's own pawns further up the board. This maneuver brings the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the weakened king side and potentially preparing a knight retreat to a more central square on f8. A decisive rupture of the pawn chain, creating immediate tactical possibilities on the c-file and potentially liberating the queen's rook. Opening the b-file now offers a dynamic tension, forcing black to confront a potential invasion, a stark contrast to the previous maneuvering. Challenging black's well-entrenched pawn structure, this knight maneuver immediately ignites the center and forces a response, aiming to dismantle the defensive shield around the black king by creating imbalances. The knight's journey to the queenside now finds a purpose, aiming to disrupt white's increasingly cramped queenside structure and exploit the weakened b-pawn. Striking at the heart of the pawn structure to shatter black's defensive pawn chain, this capture offers a potent solution to the cramped position, aiming to open lines for the white rooks and potentially exploit the exposed king. Safeguarding the monarch becomes paramount after the exchange on g7, the immediate aftermath of a doubled pawn on f7 and a compromised light square diagonal presents a tactical minefield. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, white seeks to pry open lines and disrupt black's compact structure, aiming to exploit any potential weaknesses around the king, though this aggression might leave the center vulnerable if black can counter effectively. Clearing a crucial diagonal for your bishop unlocks attacking potential, but it simultaneously opens up a fascinating strategic battle for central control and pawn structure integrity. Unlocking the queenside with this knight maneuver opens up lines for potential queenside expansion, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and create threats along the nascent queenside majority. A bold redirection of the queen, aiming to exploit the newly opened c-file and create counterplay against white's overextended pawns, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed to further advances. Unlocking the c5 square with this knight maneuver injects immediate tension, forcing black to reassess the stability of their central pawn structure. Unleashing the bishop to c4 endeavors to disrupt white's central control and create attacking chances, a bold maneuver aiming to exploit the newly opened diagonals and potentially trap the queen. Sharpening the attack, white reroutes the queen to a more active square, eyeing weaknesses and preparing to exploit the open files that have emerged from the recent exchanges. Reclaiming the queenside by bringing the rook from b8 to the active c8 square is a logical step, aiming to pressure white's advanced pawns and exploit the open c-file that will likely materialize. This maneuver also clears the path for the knight to potentially reroute, perhaps via c5, reinforcing the central pawn structure or targeting weaknesses. Finally, bringing the bishop actively into the fray, this piece repositions to the more open diagonal, preparing to exert pressure on the d-file and potentially support a future advance of the d-pawn. The rook swings into the center, activating a dormant piece and preparing to contest the crucial d-file. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside opens new avenues, but its true value hinges on how effectively those advancing soldiers disrupt black's coordination or create weaknesses for future exploitation. Unpinning the rook from the e-file finally opens a crucial pathway to challenge the central pawn structure and seize control of the open d-file, potentially creating counterplay against white's otherwise solid position. Reclaiming the open file immediately after the exchange secures white's central pressure and prepares for potential kingside advances. It's a proactive choice that doesn't let black dictate the tempo. Asserting pressure on the queenside, this maneuver looks to exploit the open file and potentially create a passed pawn or activate the rook as a potent attacking force. Targeting the knight on d7 offers a brilliant opportunity to disrupt black's queen and rook battery on the b-file, creating immediate tactical possibilities and potentially forcing material imbalances. The queen's re-entry into the fray, aiming at the exposed king and the pawn chain, signals a desperate bid to salvage something from this collapsing position, though the knight's outpost on d7 appears formidable. Sacrificing the pawn to pry open the kingside and unleash the rook's power against the exposed monarch, creating immediate attacking potential. Regrouping the monarch to the relative safety of the g-file offers a vital escape route and prepares for potential defensive maneuvers, acknowledging the exposed pawn structure and the active enemy pieces. Initiating the rook to its central egress point, this maneuver prepares for aggressive posturing along the second rank, potentially isolating black's queenside pawns while simultaneously offering a defensive retreat should the central conflict escalate unfavorably. The rook's repositioning to the first rank, though seemingly passive, sets a powerful snare. It anticipates the f-pawn's advance, preparing to be unleashed on the now open diagonal should white's knight retreat or falter. Reclaiming that outposted knight is a decisive stroke, forcing a simplification that significantly improves white's piece activity and central control, aiming to exploit the now exposed black king. Suddenly, the rook vacation on the first rank ends with an opportunistic raid, hoping to disrupt white's pawn structure and perhaps exploit the exposed king on the other side of the board. The knight's journey to d7 injects a sudden tactical jolt, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of black's queen and the precariousness of the pawn. This aggressive repositioning forces an immediate calculation of potential sacrifices and forks, disrupting black's apparent tranquility and shifting the initiative decisively. The knight's retreat to b4 signifies a positional concession, abandoning the initiative and forcing the queen to a less active square, effectively surrendering control of key central squares and allowing white to solidify their advantage. Securing the rook on its new outpost after the capture and positional exchange drastically alters the battlefield's complexion. Seizing the initiative, the rook lunges forward, aiming to exploit the king's exposed situation and disrupt white's carefully constructed pawn chain. Shifting the queen to this active square aims to exploit the exposed black king and potentially create new attacking vectors, while simultaneously offering a timely retreat if the central skirmish becomes too volatile. Reactivating the knight's journey towards the enemy king, this maneuver prepares to join the offensive on the weakened white kingside. The monarch's exposed position, now directly targeted by the queen's imposing presence on the 7th rank, represents a critical vulnerability that demands immediate attention. Reactivating the bishop to the central complex now that the immediate threats have been cleared, aiming to support the king and potentially exploit the open b-file. Absolute dominance achieved as the white queen, empowered by the knight's earlier sacrifice and the rook's central presence, delivers the final blow to an exposed monarch.